is symbolic of his freedom, and that directly contrasts even the tone and like the words used whenever he was describing his own experience in jail. So from going from being this like water loving, symbolically free man to being completely confined, it really just shows the contrast of what jail, even if you aren't, literally or figuratively free in your day-to-day life, jail really takes all of that away from you. So even if you don't think you had it to begin with, it just shows the effect of taking all that freedom away. And I guess that's especially shown in Bloodsworth, since he's so free to begin with. You can really see the contrast between jail and then him when he's not in jail.
Yeah, there was a quote that actually I found that kind of talked about that conflict and that theme of like the whole freedom thing, and it was on page 263, and it says, "How does a man recover from an experience like Kirk Bloodsworth? How does he recapture the lost years, the lost dignity? How does a man forced to become an animal in order to survive in a vile and violent jungle re-enter his community and find his way? How does a person get past being branded a monster for a crime he didn't commit?"
So I also liked that quote when I read it, because I think it really explains the impact of living in prison like Bloodsworth had to for all those years. Because, like he says, you lose the years of your life and you miss important events, not only just like in the world, but like events in your family that can happen that you completely miss out on. And like he had to like change yourself for protection. And I think that would make it extremely hard to re-enter the world, like he says. And also having been in prison and being identified as a monster, as it was in his case, would tarnish your reputation, like, for the rest of your life. People would constantly be thinking, like, that you actually did commit the murder, and they'd be kind of scared of you. So I think also what could kind of help is if there were, like, programs put in place to help people who maybe, like, were in jail and then they were, like, released, like in Bloodsworth's case, because they were actually innocent, to help, like, with that transition from, that such, like, structured life, and, like, Ashton kind of talked about later, it's so, like, I don't know what the word is for that, but, like, it's kind of, it would be scary to live there, because there's other inmates are constantly, like, threatening to kill you. They're, like, looking for ways to harm each other, and, like, they throw urine in his cell. That's just such a big gap from, like, that life to society that I think programs to help that transition would be helpful.
Yeah, I agree, because especially in Bloodsworth's case, where, I mean, he was falsely accused for being a rapist and a murderer, not, like, falsely accused for, like, shoplifting or something like that. It genuinely would be so much tougher for him, and I genuinely don't know how I would handle the situation, and I do admire for how he handles it. And as you said, I think, like, those programs would be a really good idea to help ease him into the real world, because he's lost, like, a lot of positive social skills that have been replaced by, like, survival mechanisms, like him just becoming a different person to survive. And he probably needs to learn how to trust again, especially the law enforcement, which is supposed to always protect you. And I honestly couldn't fathom how, like, hard it would be to go back into society for him, and because you can't replace those lost years. So genuinely, like, I don't know what I would do, and it would be very difficult.
I agree. As Ashton said, I think it gives a great understanding about how prison actually is in the real world, and especially when it says, in a vile and violent jungle, re-enter his community and find his way. Personally, I wouldn't be able to get back into life as the same person I was before this traumatic experience.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think not only for Bloodsworth, but for the other inmates as well. And I think this, aside from the last part, the quotes could be applicable to any inmate. So, like, in some European prisons, the inmates have TV, access to news, and, like, schooling programs, and they can even get degrees while still in prison. And the countries that have these programs in place actually have incredibly low rates of crime. So I think it's almost a cultural thing. I think America's view of justice is to sort of punish whoever's guilty and to not try to get them better, so just to, like, hurt them. And I mean, I guess, like, I'm guilty of that. Like, I've been raised here. Like, I can see the impacts of that. Like, even seeing, these, like, cases of, like, killers on TV, and you just automatically think, oh my god, like, what I would do to them if I were there. I hope they get, like, the worst thing they can possibly get to jail. Like, I hope something really awful happens to them. And I think that's such an eye for an eye mentality that's everywhere in our justice system. Something I think leads to hasty and often emotional punishments in the justice system. And I think this book sort of made me relook my view on prison, not just because of the rash punishments that could often hurt innocent people like Bloodsworth himself, but because it also just hurts the inmates that are actually in there for actual crimes they committed even more, and makes them more likely to go back to that life of crime than before they went to prison.
Yeah, and along with the scene of after you get out of prison, there was another quote that stood out to me dealing with that, and it was on page 265, and it said that Kirk decided he could never work for the same state that tried to kill him.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of get it. I think that this sentiment is really harsh and emotional, but I mean, at the same time, the justice system is similar, if not even more severe, in other places. So I feel like he could have worked for Maryland, but instead worked to reform death penalty policies. Like, just because you're working for the state doesn't mean you have to agree with everything the state stands for. You can work to go against it. But I mean, at the same time, I probably would have done the same thing. Like, I totally respect his decision.
Yeah.
Because it's emotional. It's an emotional thing. I mean, you've gone through all of these years of torment. So why would you want to do that? So I mean, logistically, if you take back, a step and you're like, oh my God, that was so, I guess, ignorant of him to step back and be like, oh, I don't want to work for them. But then, I mean, when you put yourself in his shoes and you think about everything he went through, it's like, of course you wouldn't want to work for that state, Even to try to reform it, why would you even want to be associated with that if that state did something like that to you? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you said, like, he could work to reform the death penalty, and he kind of, like, did some work involving that with, like, other organizations to, like, talk to people about why we shouldn't have the death penalty or why DNA testing was important. But personally, I agree with Bloodsworth. Like Allie was saying, whenever you take it into context of how his life was totally impacted by this whole story. And I feel like the state, like, showed their, like, unfeelingness whenever they refused to believe that Bloodsworth was innocent during all the times that he was telling them that. And even after the DNA testing, they, like, refused to put it in the system because they still thought, even though it proved that he wasn't, like, the person who committed the crime, they still, like, believed that he was.
Right.
So I feel like if they were really unfeeling then, like, how would they do in other situations if he worked for them? And I can just see that, like, I think Bloodsworth found that the state can't always be trusted to do the, like, correct and, like, human thing.
Yeah, and